All right, welcome everybody to this week's Rising Tide Foundation lecture. We are continuing our exploration about the principles behind Renaissances and Dark Ages, these two very simplified terms that are bandied about often in society. Um, Not a lot of people get a chance to really think about the richness, the context in which both of these dynamics tend to occur. There is a very important battle of ideas that I think everyone here is familiar with to varying degrees that have been shaping the continuity of all of the human experience in all cultures around the world. And there are certain common universal principles, either when goodness arises or when the inverse, when goodness is subverted. Whether, again, it happens in India, in China, in the West, whatever cultural matrix, goodness has a common character. Its opposite, folly, corruption, has certain common characteristics. And so our whole point is to try to find different case studies to better wrap our minds around these universals as they are expressed at different points in time, in space and time, in different cultures. And so today, Adam has prepared a little presentation which will introduce some things that we might have taken for granted regarding our deep past and more recent past as well. Adam's given a lot of presentations. I don't think he needs too much of an introduction. Lawyer, poet, essayist, analyst. I mean, fantastic mind. I'm very impressed every time I hear him speak. So I'm really happy that we're going to get a treat today. So Adam, thank you again. The stage is yours.
Thank you, Matt. And let me do a share screen here and pull my slideshow up. And does it do that?
Are you looking for a full screen?
Yeah, the menu blocked so I want to do the
There's the way I use.
See about. Yeah, I know the menu shrunk and it hid the. There we go. All right, so this is a topic I've been interested in some time, and it's kind of going to be a tour de force taking you all over parts of the world. So I'm going to jump right in. We use the term Dark Ages a lot of times, and it is a politically and ideologically charged term. So what I wanted to do is sort of define what a real Dark Age is, and explore some of the times where we've had actual Dark Ages in the past and how we've come out of them. So okay, what is a Dark Age? So the term was first coined by Petrarch in the famous Renaissance Italian poet. It first appears in his tract Defense Against the Calumnies of an Anonymous Frenchman from the 1330s. And his exact quotation is, "Amidst the errors there shone forth men of genius, no less keen were their eyes, although they were surrounded by darkness and dense gloom." And then he uses the term again in 1343 in his late work, his epic poem, Africa. "My fate is to live among varied and confusing storms, but for you, perhaps, if as I hope and wish you will live long after me, there will follow a better age. This sleep of forgetfulness will not last forever. When the darkness has been dispersed, our descendants can come again in the former pure radiance." So Petrarch is not describing any historical time here other than his own. He views the Dark Age as the current age of ignorance in which he lives, and talks about the contrasting pure radiance as the world he hopes to bring in for future descendants. So we don't have it used as a historiographic term yet. That will come later with Cardinal Cesare Baronio, or Baronius as he's known in Latin. He wrote a 12-volume ecclesiastical annals, which has been called the greatest history of the church ever written. And in it, he describes the age between the end of the Carolingian Empire in 888 and the reforms of Pope Clement II in 1046 as a dark age, but strictly because of the lack of historical records he had to assemble from that period. And he expressed his frustration by calling it a dark age. That term, however, would later acquire a sort of an ideological charge, first from the Protestant reformers who referred to the entire uh, age of faith essentially as a dark age, and then the French philosophers of the 18th century called themselves the Enlightenment and contrasted it with the age of faith, the Dark Ages, which was everything between the fall of the Roman Empire and the Renaissance. And we can see the Enlightenment attitude captured by Edward Gibbon in a footnote in his major work, Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. He says, all that learning can extract from the rubbish of the Dark Ages is copiously stated by Archbishop Usher in a certain work he's citing. So that reflects the Enlightenment attitude to the entire period after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. That changed soon in the 19th century when Romanticism started to view the high Middle Ages of the 13th and 14th century as an era of great culture and manners and chivalry. And so the Dark Ages, as it was used then, sort of got confined to the few centuries after the fall of the Roman Empire. Come the 20th century, there's two schools of thought as to the term. One is to discard it altogether because it imposes a value judgment. The other one follows Baronius's line of reasoning and uses Dark Age to describe an era where there's a lack of historical records. So, for example, the Greek Dark Ages, which we will talk about, or the Cambodian Dark Ages between the fall of Angkor and the 19th century. I am going to propose another definition, one that's a bit stricter than Baronius, but follows from him. And no work I've seen has adopted this exact definition, so you might all be privy to something new now. I'm going to define the Dark Ages as an age where there's a complete loss of literacy. Of course, accompanying that will be a loss of historical records, but these would be situations where we have a literate society that loses the art of writing and then rediscovers it later. It hasn't happened often, but it's happened at least 5 times. We'll talk in detail about 4 of them, and then a footnote for a 5th. So what is not a dark age? The fall of the Roman Empire, the fall of the classic Maya in Central America, the intermediate periods of ancient Egypt. Those are not dark ages because literacy was preserved. Even though it was in a reduced and restricted form, you still had the survival of literacy. We're going to be talking about ages where literate societies completely lost the art of writing, and it had to be reintroduced from outside at a later time. Before I start on our first detailed exploration, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the Indus Valley civilization. This is the first, what we know of, the earliest such dark age. We have, in what is now Pakistan and India, a urbanized, sophisticated culture in the early Bronze Age that had its own writing system, and you can see examples of its writing on the right side of the screen there. We don't know, the writing has not been deciphered. We don't know what language it encoded. There's hot debate about that. And we don't know the exact mechanisms of the fall or the immediate demographic shifts in the area. So there's just too much that remains, the jury remains out on for us to discuss in any detail. But suffice it to say, there was writing. After about 1700 BC, the writing stops, and we don't see writing reappear in India for another 13 centuries until the introduction of the Brahmi script shortly after Alexander the Great's arrival in in India. So we can consider that our first dark age, but we will let it remain dark for now until we can learn a little more about it. And I know there's been some good presentations about it that the Rising Tide Foundation has done before. But the first scenario we will discuss in detail is in Mycenean Greece, or Bronze Age Greece. I'm going to start, before we talk about the decline, I'd like to talk a little bit about the civilization itself and its writing. So what did the ancient Greeks have to say about their own history? These remote antiquity can be gleaned from two sources. Number one is Saint Eusebius of Caesarea in his Universal History. He cites the historian Castor of Rhodes, who wrote in the 1st century BC. His work is lost, but Eusebius preserves a summary of his work. And as it happened, there was an inscription found on the island of Paros called the Parian Chronicle in the 17th century. It dates from 299 BC, and it includes historical entries of events going well over 2 millennia before that, and it lines up quite nicely with what Eusebius says. So according to the Greeks, the first city to have kings was Sicyon, on the north coast of the Peloponnese. They began reigning in 2126 BC. 1891 BC, Argos, founded by Inachus. Athens in 1591 BC. Thebes by a Phoenician, Cadmus, in 1519 BC. Sparta doesn't figure in these works, but based on the generations given, its approximate founding was 1600 BC. And then according to the Greek, to Eusebius, Mycenae itself was founded from Argos in 1347 BC. And the founding myth is well known, but it's worth repeating here. Acrisius, the 14th king of Argos, had only a daughter and an oracle, Danae, and an oracle told him that his grandson would kill him. So he imprisoned Danae, but Zeus appeared to her as a golden rain. She became pregnant. Acrisius set her adrift, and then she gave birth to a son, Perseus, whom you may know from Clash of the Titans and other movies like that. He killed Medusa, married the Phoenician princess Andromeda, returned to Argos, where he accidentally killed his grandfather with a discus, thus fulfilling the prophecy. Horrified at what he had done and wanting to avoid a curse, he traded the kingdom of Argos with the king of neighboring Tiryns. He wasn't satisfied with Tiryns, so he built a citadel inland called Mycenae and began to rule there as king. And then the Greek myths go into the history of the kings. Perseus was succeeded by Electryon, who was killed by Amphitryon, another grandson of Perseus, was married to Heracles's mother. Heracles was the son of Zeus by Amphitryon's wife. And pay attention to the figure of Heracles in these stories, because it's a metaphor for another historic group of people that we'll see. We'll see that this is a representation of true events. Electryon's successor was Sthenelus, who was again killed by the sons of Heracles. His son was Eurystheus, who assigned Heracles his 12 labors as a punishment for Heracles' killing his family. And then he was killed along with all his sons in a war against Athens. So the Mycenean leaders went to an oracle who told them a descendant of Pelops, the king of Elis, who gave his name to the Peloponnese, should be chosen. So there were two brothers, Atreus and Thyestes. Thyestes was chosen, but Atreus convinced them to pick him based on an omen. So Thyestes seduced Atreus's wife, and in revenge, Atreus had Thyestes' children killed and fed to their father. When Thyestes figured out what had been done, he cursed Atreus, and that's the supposed origin of the curse on the house of Atreus. So Atreus eventually, after long reign, was killed by Thyestes, who in turn was killed by Agamemnon, who we all know is the leader of the Greeks in the Trojan Wars. Agamemnon's brother was Menelaus, who became king of Sparta by marrying Helen. And so we all hear the abduction of Helen as the face that launched 1,000 ships, but there were very practical political reasons for it. Menelaus was only king because he was married to Helen, and retrieving her was a way to ensure he retained his legitimacy as king. So then we know from the Greek tragedies, Agamemnon, when he returned, his wife Clytemnestra, who was Helen's sister, was carrying on an affair with Aegisthus, who was Thyestes' son. They killed him, and Aegisthus took the throne. Then Agamemnon's son Orestes killed Aegisthus and his own mother, went mad as a result. Aegisthus' son Aletes ruled for 2 years until Orestes returned and killed him after he had atoned for his crime. And then we sort of have the calm before the final storm. Orestes and then his son Tissamenus had a rather calm reign. Orestes ruled over not Mycenae, but Argos and Sparta as well. And then in 1103 BC, according to Eusebius, the sons of Heracles return. They destroy Mycenae and divide Orestes' realms among them, including Sparta and Argos. As an aside on this, the story from Athens is that Orestes' descendants fled and sought refuge in Athens, and the sons of Heracles attempted to conquer Athens. But the king of Athens, Codrus, heard an oracle that the king whose side, or rather side whose king was killed, would win the war. So he arranged for himself to be killed in battle, and as a result, they repelled the sons of Heracles. And there were two results of that. The first was that the Athenians decided no one was worthy to succeed Codrus as king, and they instituted a rulership called the Archon, which simply means ruler. It would eventually evolve into a yearly elected office. And we have the remote origins of Athenian democracy there. And the second important result of that was that Athens always considered itself the place where the original Greek culture was preserved from before the invasion of the sons of Heracles. So that's a little background. Now, all of this was considered largely mythological until the 19th century with Heinrich Schliemann. His discovery of Troy is primarily what boosted him to fame and what he remains known for. But after his discovery in Troy in 1871, in 1874, and the next 2 years, he went to mainland Greece and excavated Mycenae, whose ruins you can see on the right side of the screen. Now, the site was known. It had been identified by a Venetian traveler in 1700, but it wasn't considered anything really special. When Schliemann excavated it, however, he revealed a complex urban advanced civilization. And as further excavations revealed, it revealed a world pretty much as Homer describes it. Where there's city-states based on sites that figure as the residence of kings in Iliad, Mycenae, Pylos, or Nestor ruled, Sparta, Elis, Athens, Thebes. And you also see the timeline lined up quite nicely with what the Greeks themselves. We have the early Mycenean, when these kingdoms were being established according to the Greek chronicles. The kingdom of Mycenae itself in Eusebius lasted from 1347 to 1103 BC. That's almost exactly aligning with the Palatial Bronze Age. And then the collapse in around 1100 BC, we have the Palatial period. So if anything, the archaeology has corroborated what the ancient chroniclers have passed down to us. And the Mycenaean civilization itself, we can see the megalithic architecture. The top left, you can see that it's called the Mask of Agamemnon. It's a royal burial mask. It's one of the iconic artworks of Mycenaean Greece. And underneath it, you can see some fresco works which show the use of chariots and armor. And the Mycenean Greece also was one of the great international powers of the day. Further investigation, the Hittite records refer to a realm located in Greece as Ahiawa, or the Achaeans, which is the name that Homer uses for the Greeks. And then in the records of Amenhotep III, there's referred to a realm as Mukana, or Mycenae. So along with New Kingdom Egypt, the Hittite Empire, Cyprus, and then Mitanni, which was replaced by Assyria, Mycenaean Greece was one of the 5 great powers of this late Bronze Age world, and they were all interconnected through diplomacy and trade. The other notable thing about Mycenaean Greece is that it had its own writing system. So it wasn't the earliest writing system in the area. In Crete, the earlier Minoan civilization, they first had a hieroglyphic script that appears around 2100 BC, and then 300 years later, Linear A shares some signs in common with Linear B. However, neither of those have been deciphered because we don't know what language the Minoan Cretans spoke. There's a strong candidate. Classical authors reference a language called Aetio-Cretan, or original Cretan. And we do have some inscriptions in that language, but not enough to reconstruct the language. So even if that were the language of the Minoans, we don't know enough about it to decipher it. Linear B, however, which appears around 1700 BC, slightly later, around 1500 BC, is found in Mycenaean Greece as well as in Crete, indicating Mycenaean dominance in the old Minoan area. It remained undeciphered for a long time until scholars noticed that some of these symbols appeared in inscriptions in Cyprus from the Classical Age that appeared alongside Classical Greek. And in 1952, using those Cypriot inscriptions, Michael Ventris, a British scholar, was able to decipher the Linear B script. And as it turns out, it's an early form of Greek. You can see on the left side, it's a syllabic script. So we have the consonant, and then so the first line would be A, E, O, U, and then Ba, De, Do, Du, etc., etc. And you can see some of the words here. For example, Kourousso is equivalent to Greek Chrysos, which is gold, or Pate is classical Greek pater, father, etc. So the other interesting thing about the Mycenaean script, too, is that there were some verb and noun forms in Homer. In Homeric Greek is its own dialect. It's not, it only appears in Homer, and it confused scholars for a long time about why this dialect that Homer used was so unique. Well, with the decipherment of Mycenaean Greek, the odd forms Homer used are actually hand-downs from the Mycenaean age, which indicates that he was working with an oral tradition that actually came down from the time of the Trojan War. So what happened with this culture? It collapsed rather suddenly. The evidence indicate that all the palaces were destroyed by fire around the same time in the mid-12th century BC, which ended up preserving the clay, baking the clay tablets and preserving the Linear B inscriptions. And this was followed by a massive depopulation. And this is probably linked to, it's almost certainly linked to an invasion of Egypt in the reign of Ramesses III at the same time by people known as the Sea Peoples. And some of these groups that are named in the inscription, there's the Egyptian inscriptions refer to the Ekwet, which could be which is analogous to the Achaeans, the Denyen, which is Danaians, which is another name Homer uses for the Greeks, Checker, which is analogous to Tukri, which is a name Homer uses for the Trojans. And then another one, Pelizet, which could be with the Pelasgians, which is a term that the Greeks used for non-Greek speakers in the Aegean, such as the Cretans and the Lemnians. And interestingly, the Pelizet, after invading Egypt, would settle on the Levantine coast, where in the Bible they're referred to as Philistines, and give their name to the current region of Palestine. So this is very much a legacy that's still with us today. Scholars still hotly debate over what caused this outmigration and depopulation of the area, but I think the answer has been in front of us the whole time. Out of Homer, we have a 10-year war that mobilized the entire civilization in this war, and then on return, nearly all the leaders meet with disaster, not just Agamemnon, but also Idomeneus and Ajax. Several of even Odysseus, although he has a happy ending in the end. And what this shows us is that it's a society exhausted by a drawn-out war, and combined with possible drought and other factors, let the population go elsewhere. And what we have, and then we have a disappearance of the Linear B script, and then we have the emergence of a new burial culture, but also a new dialect. As you can see from the Greek dialects, we have the Dorian dialect being spoken in most of the Peloponnese. This was, and it's closely related to northwestern Greek. So this indicates a migration from those northwestern areas into the Peloponnese. This was the sons of Heracles who ended up taking over the old Mycenean areas. And you'll notice Athens was spoke the Attic dialect, which was different from the Doric, and in many ways more conservative than the Doric, indicating again, corroborating the Athenians view themselves as surviving these initial population shifts after Mycenaean Greece. So this enters what historians call the Greek Dark Ages, and that it's a true Dark Age, how we define it. Writing reemerged in Greece in the 8th century BC through contact with the Phoenicians, and this Dipilos inscription here is one of the earliest examples we have of the use of the Greek alphabet. And the Greeks pretty much took the Phoenician alphabet, but made an important innovation. They changed some of the glottal stops and aspirants into vowel signs and created the first alphabet to actually use vowels, which wasn't used anywhere in the Near East. And just as an aside, there were originally 3 versions of the Greek alphabet. The version in red you see on the map in the middle would eventually be adopted in Italy and would develop into the Latin alphabet, which we all use and which I am using with you now. But the whole knowledge of Linear B and the previous literacy was lost in classical Greece. There's a story in the early 4th century BC, so concurrent with the time of Plato, King Agesilaus II of Sparta was shown a bronze tablet with, quote, many letters marvelously old, for nothing could be made of them. And what did the king do? He sent it to the Egyptian priests to see if they could understand them, when all along it was likely the writing of his own ancestors many years ago. So that just serves to illustrate how even the memory of a once great literary culture can be lost by its descendants. Our second culture is one that has interested me for a long time, and I will delve into this. This is the immediately south of Egypt in the modern Sudan, a region called Nubia, an ancient kingdom called Kush. So Egypt, from just south of Aswan to the Mediterranean Sea, the Nile forms a clear single navigable course, and that was a large factor in Egypt remaining a unified kingdom for so long. However, when you get south of Aswan, the Nile forms a huge bend, and you run into 6 whitewater rapids or cataracts that render the river unnavigable. So the Egyptians did not penetrate much south of the first cataract. And in that area emerged a distinct culture. In its own language, it was called Kesh. The Egyptians referred to it as Kush, although they also used the term Nehezu, which refers to sub-Saharan Africans more generally. It appears in Biblical Hebrew as Kush and in Assyrian as the Kashu. The Greeks, however, use the term Aethiops, or burnt face, and they call the land Ethiopia. That has no connection to the modern nation of Ethiopia. In fact, the modern nation of Ethiopia in the 1920s adopted that name of this Nubian culture to sort of graft themselves onto that history. From the very early days, they had an urbanized culture that was significantly different from Egypt to the north. Their capital is at the site of Kerma, which you can see there, and it's called the Kerba culture. For about 800 years, from 2300 to 1500 BC, was an urban center. The Middle Kingdom pharaohs under Amenemhet I managed to conquer down to the Third Cataract, but they never reached Kerma, and the kingdom remained independent. After the collapse of the Middle Kingdom, the northern part of Egypt fell under the rule of foreign invaders called the Hyksos, and there is evidence that the Kerma kingdom allied with the Hyksos against the native Egyptian rulers in Thebes. However, in 1550 BC, Ahmose, the ruler of Thebes, drove out the Hyksos, reunified Egypt. Then in 1504 BC, his second successor, Thutmose I, doubtless out of revenge, invaded, destroyed Kerma, and annexed all of Kush to Egypt. And then for the next almost 800 years, Kush would fall under Egyptian rule. And it wasn't just a political domination, it was a complete cultural domination. The Egyptians built a new capital at a city called Napata, which you can see the ruins of the Amun temple there. And the mountain behind it is called Jebel Barkal. And that outcropping on the very left, that kind of looks like a bowling pin. The Egyptians saw in that a cobra uprearing wearing the double crown of Egypt, which kind of looked like a bowling pin on its head. So that was considered a sacred site and dedicated to Amun, the Egyptian chief deity and the deity of the city of Thebes, from which the pharaoh's new kingdom originated. The Kushites themselves, though, would become even more devoted to Amun than the Egyptians were. And they would change him a little bit. Egyptian Amun was a god of wind and invisibility and was shown as a blue man, Amun of Thebes. But the Kushite Amun, in their own language, was called Amani, and Amun of Napata was shown as a ram. And as an aside, the fossil ammonites, which are spiral shells, are named that because of the spiral ram's horns of Nubian Amun. Just a FYI. However, the Egyptian influence waned, and as the kingdom of Egypt grew weakened and divided, a local ruler named Alara declared himself pharaoh in Napata. We don't know much about him, but all his successors revered him as the founder of their dynasty. Alara's successor, Kashta, would conquer Thebes, which was a huge coup for the Amun-worshipping Kushites, and then his successor, Pie, or Pianki in Egyptian, would advance all the way to the Mediterranean Sea and receive the submission of all the various kinglets throughout Egypt, and thus reunite not just Egypt, but Kush as well into an empire that extended from deep into the Sudan to the Mediterranean. And the Egyptians acknowledged these rulers as their 25th dynasty. And this was a time of great prosperity and stability and extensive building work, particularly in the temples to Amun. And then the kings were regarded Napata as their city and were buried in pyramids, which you can see there. These are These were not modeled after the great pyramids of the Egyptian pharaohs. They were modeled after private burials, and so they're much smaller and have steeper size than the Egyptian pyramids. But there are many more throughout Kush than in Egypt. So Harko, the greatest of these rulers, ended up blowing it all by meddling in foreign affairs. In 671 BC, the Philistine city of Gaza, this is a timely presentation, I guess, was rebelling against the king of Assyria, Esarhaddon. So Esarhaddon not only crushed the rebellion in Gaza, but invaded Egypt, took over the Delta, and set up a native Egyptian, Nekhau, as a rival pharaoh. And in 667 BC, Esarhaddon's successor, Ashurbanipal, decided to finish the job. He went back to Egypt and advanced as far as Thebes, where he sacked the temple of Amun. Taharko is said to have died from shock at the result, and for the Egyptians, this was the equivalent of the sack of Rome in 411. It was completely devastating. Nekhau's son Psamtik drove out the rest of the Kushites and established Egypt under native rule again in the 26th dynasty. However, Taharku's brother, Kushite succession was brother to brother rather than father to son. So his brother and successor Tantamani retreated to Napata, but still called himself pharaoh, still adopted the pharaonic titulary, still was buried in a pyramid, still used the Egyptian state religion, and all of his successors for the next more than 300 years. And most importantly, all their inscriptions were in Egyptian hieroglyphs. So we have a pretty good record of what this period was like because we can understand the inscriptions. And you can see from the very precise dating the reigns there. And also notice from the names, the word Amani or Amun keeps reappearing. The devotion to Amun continued throughout this time. One significant change in 592 BC, the Egyptian pharaoh led a punitive expedition and ended up sacking Napata, destroyed a bunch of things, but then returned to Egypt. Out of caution, the Kushite king Aspelta built a secondary capital far to the south near the Sixth Cataract, and that would end up taking over from Napata. That capital in the Kushites' language was called Medewi. The Greeks wrote it down as Meroe, and that's what we call it today. Around 300 BC, though, there was a major cultural shift. And the Greek historian Diodorus, in quoting Agatharchides, a lost author, has this to say. The priests of Meroe, having acquired great power, when they form a resolution, they send a courier to the king with an order for him to die. The first king submitted to this cruel sentence. Ergomenes, who reigned at the time of the second Ptolemy and who was instructed in the philosophy of Greece, was the first who dared to throw off this ridiculous yoke. He went with his army to the place difficult to get to, or fortress, where was formerly the temple of gold of the Ethiopians, and caused all the priests to be massacred and instituted himself a new religion. So what we have doesn't show anything quite so dramatic, but there is definitely a cultural shift at this time. And the Ergomenes mentioned is almost certainly Arakamani, who was the first king to be buried at Meroe. And from this time, the kings made their primary residence at Meroe, with Napata just serving religious purposes. But Amun continued to be worshipped, contrary to Diodorus. However, his position becomes less important, and now he figures among native Kushite gods like Pedemak, who you can see as a lion head there, Amisemi, and then the war god Ariten, among others. The most important thing about this period, Meroitic period, is that now the Kushites began to write in their own language, make inscriptions in their own language instead of Egyptian hieroglyphs. We call the language Meroitic. There's two versions of it. The original version is a cursive script. It's alphabetic with a few syllabic symbols. And then interestingly, a hieroglyphic script was backformed from it to make inscriptions seem more formal, although the vast majority are in the cursive script. So it was fairly easy to decode, but when scholars read it, it didn't resemble any language they knew about. And it certainly wasn't an ancestor of Old Nubian, which is the next oldest language, written language in the area. So decades and decades of study and archaeological discoveries have shed some light on it. We have a basic vocabulary. We have a basic understanding of the grammar. It was almost certainly a member of the Nilo-Saharan language family, which you can see there is scattered throughout all of Africa. It includes the Songhai languages in Mali and the Maasai language in Tanzania. I would compare our current understanding to Etruscan, where we can get a good idea of a text by reading it, but we can't do a word-for-word translation yet. So much work remains to be done. And unfortunately, we don't have a complete understanding of the goings-on in this second period. Here we have a list of rulers from this time, beginning with Arakamani. One interesting thing is that now other native Kushite trends come to the front, such as the women assuming power on the throne. In Kushite, the word kore is king, and then kandake is the queen mother, and frequently women bore both titles at once, indicating an independent rule. Interestingly, in the Acts of the Apostles, it talks about the apostle Philip baptizing the eunuch of Candace, queen of the Ethiopians. Well, Candace is the title Kandaki, and it almost certainly refers to the ruler Nawidimak, who you see in the middle. So if any of you know anyone named Candace, her name ultimately comes from the Meroitic language. The other interesting thing about this time is the relations of Kush with Egypt under Greek and Roman rule to the north. The same Arakamani we discussed earlier entered into a treaty with Ptolemy II, the Greek pharaoh of Egypt, and they entered into a joint sovereignty arrangement over the 30 leagues between the first and second cataract. As Egyptian power declined in the area, the Ptolemies lost control. When Caesar Augustus conquered Egypt in 30 BC, he wanted to reassert control over the area. So his second governor of Egypt, Aelius Gallus, invaded Kush and got as far south as Napata and sacked it. But according to the classical sources, the Kushites regrouped and counterattacked and forced Aelius Gallus to agree to a peace. And in 22 BC, they reestablished a joint sovereignty, but now only for the 12 leagues south of the first cataract. That arrangement would be in place until 298 AD. So this is Rome coexisting peacefully with a neighboring kingdom for more than 300 years. And I think that's the only case in Roman history you will find that. And I don't think it's noted or discussed enough, but this was the one area where Rome was not at war with its neighbors. In Kushite art, you see some classical influence seep into it too. It was very conservative to the Egyptian tradition, but in this kiosk at Naka from the time of around Nero, you can see the arches and the Corinthian columns. This victory inscription of Prince Shorkaror from around 70. You can see a sun god with face forward in the classical style. And the captives being thrown off the mountain are shown in naturalistic poses. And then in the middle, King Tarekaniwal is shown this is a pose that at this time was over 3,000 years old. It comes from ancient Egypt. But the king is wielding a Roman sword and is wearing chainmail, indicating influence of battle armory from the north. And by all accounts, it was a mutually beneficial arrangement between Greco-Roman Egypt and Kush. So what caused the kingdom to fall? It was the rise of a neighboring power, Aksum. And just for some background, Aksum is the direct ancestor of the modern country of Ethiopia. It spoke a Semitic language called Ge'ez, which is still the liturgical language of the Ethiopian church and the ancestor of two of the most common languages of modern Ethiopia. Aksum, as you can see in the picture, is still an inhabited place, and the bishop of Aksum is still head of the Ethiopian church. And the emperors of Ethiopia, right up until the revolution in 1974, claimed direct descent from the kings of Aksum, who they in turn were claimed to descend from King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. But Aksum began to rise as a power in the second century AD, and what they did was they began minting coins. Throughout its 1,000-year history, despite being next to coin minting Egypt, Kush never minted coins. All trade was conducted through barter, and it sort of was the gateway for exotic goods, ivories, and animals and furs coming from the interior of Africa. With Aksum minting coinage, it made the medium of trade easier, and trade could now occur by ship, which was faster. So almost immediately when you see coins appear in Aksum, you see the quality of the burial monuments in Kush decline. However, the small number of royal pyramids and the inscriptions in both Meroe and in the north indicate that it still was a united kingdom, fairly stable at this time. And in fact, Yesbekiamane, the ruler here, occupied the area that became abandoned immediately south of the first cataract. After him, there's an unknown queen, and then after him, the last known ruler we have is named Aryesbehe, who had to reuse a pyramid and has a shockingly poor quality of a royal burial, indicating that there was severe stress on the kingdom at this time. However, he was buried, meaning there was a successor to bury him. The only real written record we have of the kingdom at this time comes from inscriptions of Ezana, whose coin is there. He was the first Christian ruler of Aksum, and you can see the cross on his coin there. He left an inscription talking about military campaigns in the area of the Nile around Meroe. But he never mentions any, he just mentions cities of brick and stone. And the Kushites are almost mentioned as an afterthought. His primary target was two tribes called the Red and Black Noba. And he assumes the title King of Kush, but we don't know if that was an actual vassalage arrangement or just an empty boast. And there is evidence of an Aksumite presence at Meroe, just nothing permanent. And we don't know if that came before or after the abandonment of the city. There is evidence that there were squatters building huts in the abandoned temples, followed by a fire. And then that's the last we have of the great cities in the heartland of Meroe. The next account we really, big picture account we have of this area is from 200 years later, when Justinian sends Christian missionaries. And they find three kingdoms in the area, Nobatia, Makuria, and Alodia, all of them speaking Old Nubian, which we mentioned is a different language from Meroitic. So what happened in the meantime? The most compelling evidence comes from the north, two sites called Balana and Kustul, which are on opposite sides of the river. There were burial mounds there, which are called tumuli. The reason I have such an old picture there is because those sites are now underwater. With the building the Aswan Dam in 1952, it flooded every archaeological site that was not either moved to higher ground or sent to a European city as a souvenir. However, fortunately, in the 1930s, Walter Emery uh, thoroughly excavated these sites, and what he found was tombs of what he calls the X group, which is post-Meroitic, pre-Christian. And there were 11 royal burials, and they included these magnificent crowns that you see on the right side here. Notice these date from the 4th and 5th centuries, so they're contemporary with St. Augustine and Attila the Hun. And they're still in the native Egyptian religious style, which speaks to the how enduring that tradition was. But interestingly, the tomb showed pottery and weapon styles different from the Kushites, as well as evidence of human sacrifices, which the Kushites did not practice. So this was an elite that was foreign to the area. Even more compelling evidence comes from a site a little to the north called Kalabsha. This was called Talmus by the Greeks. There's a temple there which you can see was moved to higher ground when the lake flooded. It was built by Caesar Augustus in his role as pharaoh as a goodwill gesture to the new peace arrangement and dedicated to a Kushite god, Merul or Mandulus in Greek. It was used throughout, even after Rome abandoned it, even after the fall of the Kushite Empire, and eventually was converted into a church. So it was used through this whole dark age we're talking about. And there's, on the same wall, there are 2 graffiti here. They're actually royal inscriptions, but they're not of the degree of quality to be anything beyond graffiti. The first is the latest known Meroitic inscription. It's by a king named Karamadoye, and his name is Meroitic. He uses the title Kore, and he attributes his victory to Amun and Ariten, just like everything that had come before. A few feet from it, however, along with a crude depiction of the king, is another inscription of a king named Silko. This one is in Greek, and in bad Greek, it contains several grammatical errors. It refers to the ruler as a Basiliskos, or prince, because the Roman emperor used the word king, Basileos. And it refers to himself as prince of the Nubades and the Ethiopians. That in the Nubades mentioned first before the native Kushites. And it credits his victory to a singular god, which is strange because the area wasn't Christianized until a century later. So all this indicates that Silko had to import someone from Egypt to make this inscription. What's even more remarkable is some of the common references between them indicate that these inscriptions were only a generation apart. So in the space of 25 years, we went from literacy in Meroitic to needing to import someone from a foreign country in a foreign language to commemorate the king's victory, which shows how quickly the collapse was in this area. So as we mentioned, with the Christianization in 543 came reintroduction of literacy. And by now there was a new language, Old Nubian. And so to create a script for it, the Christian missionaries adopted the Coptic alphabet. What Coptic is, it's the latest phase of the ancient Egyptian language. Again, it's still a liturgical language in the Coptic Church, and it used the Greek alphabet with a few extra signs derived from Demotic Egyptian. So the Egyptian Christian missionaries used this alphabet and added a few more characters to accommodate the Old Nubian sounds. And interestingly enough, 2 of these characters are derived directly from Meroitic. Those are the ones in red with the Meroitic equivalent shown below. So even a century after the Karamadoye inscription and the loss of Meroitic, there was still enough residual knowledge of the language for it to figure into literacy. However, by now, it was most likely a dead language. And then just as an epilogue, Christian Nubia would repel the initial Arab invasions and would last another 1,000 years. And the area wouldn't be Islamicized until the Ottoman Turks in the 16th century. So that's our second feature there. Let me take a drink and we'll launch into. I was originally just going to do a third, but there's a closely related fourth that we'll talk about too. This is what's called sub-Roman Britain. And I know Jerry made a good presentation about King Arthur, but I want to take sort of a different focus from that, and there won't be really any overlap between our presentations. So Britain was known to the classical world. It was called the Greeks called it the Cassiterides, or the Tin Islands, because it was a source of tin, which was a key ingredient in making bronze. And in fact, Cornwall is still known for its tin mines. Himilco of Carthage visited in the 6th century BC. Pythius of Massilia was the first Greek to write about visiting it in 325 BC. By that time, it was inhabited by Celtic-speaking tribes. Julius Caesar, in 55 BC, conducted 2 expeditions as part of his conquest of Gaul, because the British chieftains were aiding his Gaulish enemies. And in 54 BC, he actually landed there, but due to a storm, he was forced back. Augustus planned no less than 3 different invasions, but never undertook it. Caligula led a force to the English Channel in the year 40 and ordered them to collect seashells and return back. Finally, in 43, under the reign of Claudius, his general Aulus Plautius conquered Britain. By 54, they had conquered as far as Lindum, which is the city of Lincoln in the north. And then by the 70s, the Roman rule had extended into what is now Wales and the south of Scotland. In works, Britain is kind of portrayed as an outpost of the Roman Empire, but really it was a fully integrated part of the empire. Its capital was Londinium, modern London. Other important cities were Eboracum or York, Lindum or Lincoln, Isca or Exeter, Camboracum, Cambridge. You can see the continuity of the names from those. And in fact, many towns ending in Castor, Chester, Cester come from the Latin word castrum or camp. So we have Lancaster, Winchester, Leicester. Those all have ultimately Roman origins for their names. The black lines on the map on the left side are the Roman roads. And then on the right side is a plot of the Roman coin discoveries for about 13 years, showing the concentration or extent of Romanization in the country. And in fact, Rome would divide it first into 2 and then into 4 provinces, indicating that it required administrative attention. Hadrian visited it on his tour of the empire and built Hadrian's Wall, and then his successor would build the Antonine Wall north of Edinburgh. However, Rome throughout the 3rd century had a problem, or I'm sorry, Britain throughout the 3rd century had a problem with maintaining unity with Rome. In 193, the governor, Clodius Albinus, was emperor there for 4 years. In 263, it was part of the breakaway Gallic Empire for 11 years. And then in the 280s and 290s, there was another revolt in Britain against Roman rule. And then in 306, the son of the emperor Constantius Chlorus, Constantine, was in command of the British legions, and he proclaimed himself emperor there and would end up conquering the whole empire. So you can say Constantine had his original base in Britain. The decline of Roman rule in Britain, though, is a story of hubris and incompetence, and I think it's worth going into. This starts with Magnus Maximus. So just some background. In the year 378, The Roman Empire was technically united, but it was governed separately in the East and West. The West was ruled by two brothers, the 19-year-old Gratian and the 7-year-old Valentinian II, and the East was ruled by their uncle Valens, who was killed in 378 against the Goths, a devastating battle for Rome, known as Adrianople. Gratian, as the new senior ruler, appointed a ruler, an emperor in the East, and that was the Spanish general Theodosius, a devout Christian who would end up establishing Christianity as the official religion of the empire and closing down all the remaining pagan ceremonies, including the Olympic Games and the gladiatorial games. But in Britain, Theodosius's former commander, Magnus Maximus, proclaimed himself emperor with his army in a revolt against Gratian. They accused Gratian of favoring Alan mercenaries. The Alans were an Iranian-speaking tribe that Rome had hired as mercenaries. So Magnus took most of the soldiers, crossed into Gaul, defeated and killed Gratian in 383. He advanced into Italy, where imperial residence was at Milan. Well, I'll get to that in a second. He advanced into Italy. St. Ambrose, the bishop of Milan, negotiated a peace with Valentinian and Theodosius, and they recognized him as emperor, and he made his capital at Treverorum, which is the modern city of Trier in Germany. But Magnus wasn't done yet. He advanced against Valentinian again. The imperial residence was Milan, and Valentinian fled to Theodosius, and then the two emperors marched against Magnus, defeated and executed him. Not only was this a civil war that weakened Rome's internal strength, but it had deprived Britain of most of its Roman troops. But that wasn't enough. Valentinian would die of suicide, possibly autoerotic asphyxiation in 392. Theodosius would become sole emperor and then divide the empire. It would turn out for the last time between his two sons, Arcadius, who was 18, and Honorius, who was 11. Arcadius in the east, Honorius in the west. And his two sons were equally worthless. They were not mentally astute or energetic at all. Now, Arcadius was fortunate in the east because his wife, Eudoxia, and then eventually his daughter and daughter-in-law, Pulcheria and Eudocia, who are revered as Christian saints, would govern the empire fairly competently without him. But in the West, Honorius wasn't so lucky. His reign was dominated by a series of military strongmen. The first was Stilicho, who you see here. He was a half-Vandal who had risen through the ranks and eventually married Honorius's cousin, Serena, and then married his own daughter to Honorius. In 401, the Visigoths under Alaric were invading. They invaded into the Balkans first and then threatened Italy. Out of fear, Stilicho had Honorius move the capital from Milan to Ravenna, which at the time was surrounded by marshes and therefore defensible. Stilicho depleted the forces along the Rhine to shift them to Italy to fight the Visigoths. He had hoped that the Roman allies, the Franks, the Germanic tribe, would be able to hold off the Vandals, the Alans, and the Suevi, who were other tribes threatening from the east. However, the coalition ended up defeating the Franks and entering Gaul and ravaging it. So in 407, in response to that defeat, the new governor of Britain, Flavius Constantinus, or Constantine, the so-called third, proclaimed himself emperor, took all the remaining troops out of Britain, crossed into Gaul, made his capital at the modern city of Arles in Provence, and decided he would fight off the invaders there. Stilicho, caught between the Visigoths and Constantine, paid tribute to the Visigoths, decided he would fight off Constantine instead. So he paid massive tribute to the Visigoths to hold them off and marched against Constantine. Honorius, however, a hardcore faction opposed this, led by Olympius. They led a coup against Stilicho, deposed and executed him, and reversed course. Honorius recognized Constantine and withdrew the tribute from the Visigoths. The Visigoths, now incensed, invaded Italy and then sacked Rome on August 24th of 411 and ravaged the city for 3 days. And that was the famous sack of Rome that was devastating to the Roman view and to the classical worldview. Olympius was now replaced with Jovius as Honorius's advisor, and they finally turned against Constantine, defeated him. He surrendered, but he was executed instead of his promised ecclesiastical office. All the while, however, Britain remained undefended because Constantine had crossed into Gaul with all the remaining soldiers. So Saxon pirates from the area that is now where Germany, present-day Germany and Denmark border, they had ravaged the coast at the time. In 410, the Romans remaining in Britain sent an embassy to Honorius begging for assistance, saying that, quote, they were reduced to such straits that they revolted from the Roman Empire, rejected Roman law, reverted to their native customs, and armed themselves to ensure their own safety. The following year, Honorius rejected their request. It's called the Rescript of Honorius. He basically told them to look after their own affairs. There would be another plea to the general from the residents of Britain to the general Aetius in 443, but Rome by then was in no position to offer any help. And that's really the last we hear in the Roman world about Britain for another almost 200 years. The next we hear is in the reign of Pope Gregory the Great. Constantine had banned Christian slaves, so when slavery was still existed, but was a dying institution at this time, so captives from non-Christian areas would be sold in the markets. And it was Pope Gregory's habit to buy slaves and set them free and baptize them. So in 595, the story goes, he saw these blonde boys in the slave market and asked where they were from. And the response was, sunt Angli, they are Angles. And the Pope said, non sunt Angli, sed Angeli. They are not Angles, but angels. And he entrusted them to the care of a local abbot of a monastery, Augustine, who would later be known as St. Augustine of Canterbury. He trained them in Latin, and then Augustine went on a mission to convert the island of Britain. And there he found 7 kingdoms known as the Heptarchy, all speaking Old English. There were 3 tribes, the Saxons, the West, East, and South Saxons, whose kingdoms are West Essex, Sussex, the 3 kingdoms of the Angles, which are East Anglia, Mercia, and Northumbria. And then the Jutes had the kingdom of Kent in the southeast. Augustine converted King Ethelbert of Kent, whose capital was at Canterbury, which is why the Archbishop of Canterbury is still the primate of England. And then they reintroduced literacy with the Old English language set to the Latin alphabet. This was the same pattern as in Nubia, where we have a loss of contact and a reintroduction of literacy along with conversion to Christianity. So what happened during these intervening 200 years? We have a few better sources than in Nubia. We have the Confession of St. Patrick, which doesn't talk much about the political situation. We have the works of Saint Gildas, a monk at the time, which are very valuable. And then after those are the only two contemporary sources. Afterwards, we have St. Bede's History of the English People, which dates from 731, and then the History of the Britons by the monk Nennius. And then later we have the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle from the reign of Alfred the Great, but starting with then, the sources tend to become mythologized and ideological. So for our purposes, I'll just confine this to these three sources. Immediately after the Roman evacuation under Constantine, Gildas talked about all the counselors, together with that proud usurper, made the mistake of inviting, quote, the fierce and impious Saxons to settle in Britain. A small group came first and settled on the eastern side of the island by the invitation of the unlucky usurper. Well, Bede identifies this usurper as Vortigern. And as it turns out, the name Vortigern in Celtic equates to Superbus Tyrannus, although likely was a personal name. There's in Old Irish, the name Forchtern essentially means the same thing. And according to Bede, Vortigern invited the Saxon chiefs Hengist and Horsa in 449. And then they ended up turning against the native Britons settling in Kent and forcing the Britons back to London by 457. Interestingly enough, in the Pillar of Eliseg, which you see here, was erected by the Welsh kings of Powys. And it's only about 300 or 400 years after Vortigern supposedly lived, and they trace their descent to Vortigern, who they say was a son-in-law of Magnus Maximus, the prior usurper. Also, we have Saint Germanus of Auxerre, who was invited into Britain twice. The Christian population remained there, and he was sent by the Pope to deal with spread of Pelagian heresy. He made 2 voyages, and according to, I think it's Bede, condemned Vortigern, cursed him, and Vortigern was forced to flee to Wales, where fire fell from heaven. This is some of the last contact, again, we have between continental Europe and Britain. There was a British bishop attending a synod in Gaul in 455, and then no record of any contact after that. After Vortigern, we have Ambrosius Aurelianus. Gildas mentions him by name, attributes him Roman birth, and says that, quote, under him our people regain their strength and challenge the victors to battle. Bede says the same thing and says that under his leadership, the Britons regained their strength and challenged their victors, and with God's help won the day. Nennius also calls Aurelius the son of a Roman consul, says that he was feared by Vortigern and forced Vortigern to flee into Wales. However, the chronicles, Geoffrey of Monmouth and others, mention Uther and Arthur Pendragon after Aurelius. However, neither Gildas, Bede, nor Nennius make any mention of them. Nennius does mention Arthur, but only as a mere soldier in a battle of Baden Hill, or Mount Baden. And Mount Baden is seen as a decisive defeat by the native Britons over the invading Saxons. Gildas describes it as occurring sometime between the year 493 and 500. And this actually squares pretty well with both Bede's chronicle and with the archaeological evidence. Bede talks about, in his chronicle, comes up with a series of what he calls Bretwaldas, or paramount kings of England. And the first of these, he says, is Alla of Sussex, who landed in 477. And may have been the chieftain who was defeated by the Britons at Mount Badon. And Bede doesn't mention another Brett Walda until 568 or 560 rather, with Killen of Wessex. So there's a 50-year gap, and there's also an archaeological hiccup in the Saxon settlement for about 50 years. So the native Britons did defeat the Saxons and stave them off, but it wasn't enough to stem the tide. According to the traditional accounts, kingdoms continued to be founded. And then by 568, we have the first record of a battle between Saxon rulers, the rulers of Wessex and Kent. Before that, all battles were Saxon versus Britain. In this time, too, we have the linguistic replacement, and it's an almost total replacement of both Latin and Celtic by Old English. And there is almost no Latin or Celtic substrate in the Old English language. In fact, I don't think you will find maybe 5 or more words in English that ultimately come from Celtic. And this is in stark contrast to everywhere else, where the invading Germanic-speaking elites ended up abandoning their own language and adopting Latin. That was the case in France and Spain and in North Africa with the Franks, the Visigoths, and the Vandals. So what was different here is that there was a systemic collapse. There was no infrastructure, whereas in continental Europe, the population, there was a infrastructure and established system and clergy. It was easier for the invaders to adapt the language of their subjects than vice versa. In Britain, it was an abandoned wild country, essentially, and the new invaders could do what they wanted. Latin had no status, and it was not economically viable. And what we have is a sign of an elite takeover by a small warrior group. A clue at this can be seen in the laws of Ina of Wessex, who was a later ruler. For example, it set the weregild or ransom value of an Englishman twice as that of a Briton. It classified the native Britons as Wales or foreigners, and that's the origin of the words Wales and Cornwall. They were Celtic speaking and regarded as foreign. So all of this incentivized assimilation of the locals into the customs of the Germanic-speaking conquerors. They would be classified now as English or Saxon instead of foreigners or Britons. And this is supported actually by DNA evidence. Only about 25 to 40% of modern English DNA is from Anglo-Saxon contribution. And interestingly, it's a much higher proportion of Y DNA, which is passed from father to son, which indicates a largely male soldier class occupying the area and marrying into the local culture and assimilating them. So again, by the time really less than a century, this process was largely complete. And when Augustine of Canterbury arrived, he found a largely Germanic-speaking people populating England. I know I promised 3, but I couldn't resist this 4th one. The same dynamic as in England occurred in the southern Balkans. From the 4th through this is part of the Roman Empire again. The southern Balkans in Thrace and Macedonia were Greek-speaking, and in fact, Thrace and Macedonia were part of the Greek world from the Classical Age. North of that was Illyria, which had a native Illyrian language, which may have been related to modern Albanian, but by now was largely Latin-speaking. From the 4th through the 6th century, the northern Balkans were a passing route for the Germanic tribes, and the Ostrogoths, the Gepids, and the Lombards all set up kingdoms there before moving west. So that area was lost to Roman control fairly early. However, the southern Balkans remained firmly in Roman, Eastern Roman, or what we'll call Byzantine hands. And as you can see there, it was urbanized. The roads are marked there on the map, and it was actually quite close to the eastern capital at Constantinople. However, in 562, a Turkic-speaking group from the Caucasus called the Avars set up a kingdom along the Danube. And they were the ruling class, and they were accompanied by a soldier class of Slavs who were Indo-European speaking from what is now Russia and the Ukraine, that area. By the 580s, the Slavic tribes had advanced as far south as Crete, and in fact, you can see the loss of control of the Byzantine Empire on the map on the right. And then on the map on the left, you can see some of these Slavic-speaking tribes going well into the Peloponnese and even south into Crete. The Byzantine Empire under Justinian and Heraclius had exhausted itself in the wars with Persia, so it could not defend this end of its empire. And it's an all-imperial authority in the Balkans outside of Thessalonica disappeared. And then we have the same sort of language shift that happened in Britain. We have an elite soldier class, the Slavs, using social pressure to incentivize the natives to identify as the new ruling ethnic group. There's actually very little genetic impact on the Balkans and in Greece at this time from the Slavic tribes. It was almost entirely social pressure that led to this language shift. Also at this time, another Turkic-speaking group called the Bulgars advanced from the Volga. And in fact, a remnant of the Bulgars still exists on the Volga. It's the Chuvash people of central Russia. But anyway, the Bulgars came in and set up a kingdom in Thrace. And again, like the Avars, used the Slavs as their soldier class. And actually, the elite Turkic-speaking Bulgars assimilated into the Slavic class as well. And the Bulgar language was lost. We know very little of it now. For all intents and purposes, it was now a Slavic speaking kingdom. And as you can see, it expanded into the areas that are now Bulgaria, the Republic of Macedonia, Serbia, etc. The key moment came, though, in 864, when the Bulgarian ruler, who was called a Khan, they had the Turkish title of Khan, just like Genghis Khan or Kublai Khan. His name was Boris, which is actually a Turkic name. He converted to Christianity in 864. However, he was very shrewd about it. He wanted to keep his Bulgarian church independent of both Constantinople and Rome. So he founded two schools, one at Preslav, which was his capital, and one at Ohrid, which was the formerly Greek Heraclea and Cestus. And he commissioned Christian scholars to set up literary schools there. We have Saint Naum of Ohrid and Saint Cyril and Methodius. However, he wanted the literature to be in his own Slavonic Bulgarian language, and to accommodate it, these saints developed a script, and that's what we call the Cyrillic script after Saint Cyril. You can see the original version at top right, and the modern Russian Cyrillic is right below it. And this went a large step to create Slavonic Bulgarian as a literary language separate from Greek and maintain the kingdom's independence from the Byzantine Empire. Boris abdicated in 889 to lead a religious life, but in 893, his son Vladimir attempted to restore the traditional religion, and Boris returned, suppressed it ruthlessly, and then convened a council at Preslav, and under it all Greek-speaking clergy were expelled, and it was decreed that Slavonic, not Greek, would be the only accepted liturgical language. And that effectively marked the Byzantine influence in the area and established these areas as Slavic-speaking. Now, the Byzantine Empire would reconquer Bulgaria in 1014, but that domination would only last until 1185. And it was not enough to change the linguistic shift that had already occurred in the area. And that's why Bulgaria, Macedonia, Serbia speak Slavic languages. They emerged from similar dark ages as we saw in Nubia and in England. So, what can we draw from all this? So, the conditions that support literacy have to erode first. One of the main factors we've seen in the decline of literacy is war. We have the Trojan War in Mycenean Greece. We have the rebellions of Magnus and Constantine. We have the Persian Wars by the Byzantine empires. That leads to a loss of political stability. Only in the case of Kush do we see an economic shift leading to the decline of stability. And this decline of stability renders the area vulnerable to outsiders seeking to expand into a new land, agriculture, place to settle, etc. In the case of Kush, this was particularly extreme. The Nile River offered an attractive settlement to the desert tribes surrounding it. Then we have the non-literate outsiders occupying and setting themselves up as an elite. This was what the Dorians were after Mycenaean Greece. This is what the X group was in Nubia. This is what the Angles and Saxons were in Britain. And this is what the Slavs were in the Balkans. And they used their status and social pressure to convince natives to adopt their ways and assimilate into them. Notably, and there has to be an economic and social incentive to do so. This was not the case in continental Europe, where the Roman infrastructure remained largely in place. And the invaders were taking over a kingdom rather than establishing their own rule. And then in Bulgaria, we see a conscious effort to create a literary tradition out of the new language. In fact, it was specifically done to spite or counter the efforts by the Greek-speaking Byzantine Empire to reestablish control in the area. And then in all cases, I think this is interesting, literacy ends up coming back. In Greece, this was through commercial contact. But in 3 of the 4 cases, literacy is reintroduced with Christianity, largely because Christianity is a textually based religion with a textualized ritual, which is why I always laugh when I see that bumper sticker that says, when religion ruled the world, it was the Dark Ages. Well, the historical record actually bears out the complete opposite. So that leads us, and I think the reliterizing, I think, is a bright spot. It shows a natural human tendency to want literacy, to want preservation record, to want learning, which I think contradicts the Hobbesian view that our natural state is barbarism. No, there's a human longing for this. It's just circumstances have to allow for it. So are we heading to a dark age? We have wars. We have wars leading to destabilization, which I think you're already seeing. We have population flows. However, they're literate populations. I think the world is in a unique state now where most languages are written, and the risk of loss of literacy would have to be very, very low. However, I won't rule that out as a possibility. However, as the past teaches us, literacy will survive somewhere and it will return where it is lost because there's that human tendency. So with that, I will conclude and open the floor to any questions anyone might have.
Thank you, Adam. That was more than I expected, and it's definitely worth going back to and rewatching with even greater diligence than the first round, because you've just put so much together. And Could you, are you planning on making this into a written essay as well, or do you want to keep this purely
Oh,
as a
I would like to, if possible.
okay, I'm looking forward to that because this is just such a good overview. I've again, I do have a lot of thoughts and questions, but I would open the door to anyone listening who would like to pose a thought that was sparked or a question that was sparked from this composition by either putting your name in the chat box like usual or your little digital hand. That's good too. Um, well, I guess the question I have in your research. Um, The I had recently written a paper going through a little bit of the Khazar kingdom and the previous Jewish kingdom of the Himyarites as well, that had endured since I think 380 to 520 ish or so. And you had brought up the kingdom of Aksum,
Mhm.
that had coexisted with the Himyarites before they became Jewish. And this Aksum kingdom professed to be people who came descended from Solomon and Sheba. Was this a Jewish influenced kingdom? And is this, or what was this? And also, what is your idea of the Ethiopian Jews and where do they come from?
Oh wow, that's a whole other presentation in itself, and I have researched into this a lot. So, um, like I mentioned, the Ge'ez language of the Aksumites is Semitic, and it's descended from a language spoken in South Arabia called Sabaean, or the Kingdom of Saba, or in the Bible, it's called Sheba. So there is a connection between the Ethiopians and the Queen of Sheba, or the idea of the Queen of Sheba. And the Himyarites, they were originally a breakaway kingdom from Saba and would eventually take over all of South Arabia. And one of the titles the Himyarite rulers used was King of Saba or King of Sheba. So their Ethiopian Jews, their origins are kind of shrouded in mystery. They're called falashas in Ethiopia. But they're definitely present in the early centuries of the Aksumite Empire. Um, where they came from is not well known or understood, and I would like to read more about them specifically. But even the later Christian tradition um, sees the Aksumites and their successor kingdoms as in the Jewish tradition. In fact, as the real heirs of King Solomon. Um, so I don't know. Did that answer your question?
Give me something to work with. More than
Yeah.
nothing I had. So that's good.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I would imagine, Jerry. I'll put you on the spot. I know you've been researching a lot of these periods, a lot of these stories from your own vantage point, and I was wondering if you had any thoughts or to offer as well.
Well, I was just interested. I mean, Adam made a good point about Christianity and a textual religion, as you said, because I've always heard that about Islam too, that it was people learning the language by reading the Quran, which developed their culture. And I know in Britain, it on the one hand, you're talking about dark ages, but I'm more concerned about how we get out of one. And it also seems it's the same thing with language. And in the case of Britain, well, you say it was Christianity itself, but the first person I've seen who actually tried to, I don't know, for use of a better word, invent the English language was Chaucer. And I wondered if you thought the same or if you have more knowledge on that at all.
Well, Chaucer is in a different time because he was dealing with the post-Norman conquest. See, what I talk about in my lecture here is the replacement of the local Latin and Celtic with Anglo-Saxon. And then we have the Norman invasion, which introduces French into the mix. And we have an elite-speaking Norman French, and then now the Anglo-Saxons are the underdogs. However, by now, Old English is a written language with its old literary tradition, so it's hard to force the assimilation that the Anglo-Saxons did to the original occupying force. And what happens over the years, and what I think Chaucer exemplifies, is you have this combination of Norman French and native Anglo-Saxon into this new English language. And you can, my favorite example is the word for food, like the talking about the animals, cow, pig, sheep, come from the Germanic, whereas on the table where the elite would find them, it's beef, pork, mutton, from bœuf, porc, mouton. They were the elites would see the animals cooked for them, and the Anglo-Saxon would be caring for them in the barns. So we have that merger of the two traditions, but that's later. And I think that has to occur because we have two literary languages now fighting for the same space. And I don't know if you know this, but in judicial opinions in England, they were authored in Norman French right up until the Restoration, so into the late 17th century. So under Elizabeth and James I, all these judicial decisions are being written in Norman French. And in law, we have, again, that's a large source of Norman French words. And we even have doctrines that we use today called cypre. And Sison is Anglo-Saxon, but these words come from Norman French that we use.
I love the point that you made at the beginning of Edward Gibbon and how it's sort of like it was reflective of the technique you used around the term complexity today, to get people to put like a wall around a big chunk of reality that their minds are not allowed to traverse. And it's like, oh, it's too complex to think about. And so don't go there. Don't even bother exploring that domain. It's very, very similar misuse of the term Dark Ages between like the collapse of the Western Roman Empire and I guess the emergence of the earliest Renaissance moments, like 1,000-year chunk of human civilization. Just, it's dark. There's nothing to look at there. Don't bother thinking about it. It was a fun way to introduce this. John, do you have yes, you do. John, please.
Thank you very much, Adam. This was very interesting. I do have a question or comment. My impression is that many of these Dark Ages are in fact a lot shorter than the official chronology tells us. It doesn't take away from the essence of what you're saying, which is the collapse of one written culture and the replacement with another one. But for example, my impression is that Mycenean Greece was its collapse isn't in the 14th century, but closer to the 9th century before the current era. And similarly, for the collapse of the Harappan civilization, I think the Brahmi script is much older than what it is currently claimed to be, and so the chronological distance between the collapse of the Harappan civilization, which most likely was Sanskrit, and the replacement with the Brahmi script, I think these. Because when you do the stratigraphic analyses of these sites, you don't find 500 years missing. You find very possibly there's a thin line describing some natural disaster or a series of natural disasters, but very quickly it gets replaced by the new culture.
Well, that is specifically why I did not go into much detail about the Harappan civilization, because there are many open questions, and there are some of the points you raised, such as about the language being Indo-European and about the timeline and about the Brahmi script being older. There are valid studies indicating those. And I didn't want to open up, well, did this happen versus did it? I just wanted to mention it. But I think it is established that this one script did disappear and then writing did reemerge. As for Mycenean Greece, I tend to be a purist, and I view the Greeks' own version of the events of the Trojan War and the centuries following. I think they got it right. I see less wiggle room for that timeline, but that doesn't mean that the Mycenaean script itself might not have survived a little longer after our last records indicate, or that the Greek alphabet was introduced earlier than perhaps we think. But I think the valid point remains is there was one writing system lost, and then literacy had to be reintroduced at a later time. And also, these are the two most historically remote civilizations we discuss. So there are going to be open questions simply because the more further back in time you go, the more evidence has been destroyed.
Okay. But the thing is that for the Mycenean, the Trojan War, if you read the Iliad, they're clearly talking not simply about battles between human beings, but titanic battles of the gods, i.e., the planets. So, so the what is it? I don't remember who was encouraged to throw a spear at Ares, and with the cry of 9 or 10,000 warriors, he goes running off to
Diomedes.
Yes, so Ares runs off to Olympus to complain to Zeus, who tells him, "Just shut up, be a god." But the thing is that the one way of interpreting that is in fact the creation of the Balnearis Marinaris, the great canyon on planet Mars, which is the largest canyon by far on the solar system. So there's two ways of reading the Iliad. There's actions between human beings and actions at the celestial level.
Well, and that's why it's a work of literature. And that's what makes it great. It's Homer is not just it's not a historical account. It's not just Homer saying, "Oh, X fought Y and killed him." There's this battle of the gods, and I think it's the incorporation of those two battles that make this the masterful literary work it is. But that doesn't, I would submit, that doesn't discount from the historical value that the text also has. I think this was a real event. I think it's archaeologically proven that this was a real event. But how Homer portrays that by adding this extra element is what makes the epic so powerful.
Yeah. I think that great classical art tends to have multiple layers where one can read it depending on, nothing is literally just saying one thing in a binary way, but great metaphorical art is able to communicate on multiple layers of reality at the same time, simultaneously. So who knows? Yeah, it's a good discussion point. Stephen.
Okay, I'm off mute. Thanks, Adam. Another fantastic lecture. Loved it. I'm going to refrain from talking about Graham Hancock suggesting the Arctic cover Ethiopia because that'd be just way too much fun for me to go down the rabbit hole. But instead, I have an idea or a thought in terms of what you've done here today, because it seems to me you've kind of discerned a repetitive pattern, for lack of a better term, in terms of the breakdown of civilization and so on and so forth. Have you considered, or would you consider, maybe taking a generalization of it and maybe placing it within a framework like Carroll Quigley's The Evolution of Civilizations, for example, and just try to link it to one of the classic works in historical analysis?
I would love to do that. My problem is there's only so many hours in a day, and I have a family to support. I have all these ideas churning in my head and projects I'd like to get to. I will I will chalk that one up and hopefully one day get to it.
Okay, thanks, Adam.
No, thank you.
Jerry, you got a follow up?
Yes, I had one other thought. I was listening to John, and it because when I was doing my presentation on Arthur, I kind of tried to show the difference between Geoffrey's conception of Arthur and the later Norman, degeneracy and decline of the conception of Arthur. And I was also thinking about the Greeks that you and John were talking about. And from what I remember, when I was reading Homer, he always spoke quite respectfully about the gods. They were nice people. And later, like Homer, I was just reading his hymn to Apollo. And according to Homer, Apollo's role was like a messenger between the gods and man. He was sort of in between, which is interesting to think about. But then you have this later degeneracy of Apollo, later myths of him, where he's really a horrible person, as are all the Greek gods. You read about Zeus, and he's just disgusting. And I'm wondering, with the Dark Age, and you have that loss of literacy, is there a correspondence with this degeneracy in man's conception of God, of religion? I don't know if you thought about that, but I wanted to throw that out there for you, Adam.
Well, no, that's an essay on its own. And one of the reasons St. Augustine was so convincing in his tract against paganism in the City of God was he said, look at Zeus, look at Apollo. These are horrible people. Are these characters you want to imitate? And the reason for that is I can't remember the author, but it's a book about the Greek myths, and it tells the myths and gives extensive, like pages long footnotes about the origins of these stories. And in many instances, Zeus was grafted onto different local traditions. Like he has all these mistresses who have illegitimate kids who become the heroes. And what the theory is that throughout, as the stories were retold, Zeus was put into the position of formerly local gods, or putting them above the local goddess to sort of make him ubiquitous and sort of a universal force everywhere. And it ended up being haphazard. And Zeus, in the end, just became a philanderer. But the underlying stories are far older than the grafting of Zeus or Apollo or Poseidon or whoever onto them. And I think it represents sort of a union of pre-Greek and later Mycenean Greek with eventual Doric Greek traditions. And you kind of see the same thing, but a different dynamic in Egypt, where you have local cults being merged into a syncretic religion that doesn't really work because it has two moving parts. That's the dynamic, I think, that was going on there.
Jared?
Yeah, that makes sense. It's sort of like I wouldn't mind being a Christian in the 4th century, but today it's getting kind of weird.
In your mind, could the peoples of the sea that Ramses III was fighting, possibly with some allies from Greece, as is recounted by Plato, could that have been the Atlanteans, or is that something else? Who are the peoples of the sea?
The peoples of the sea, I think, are pretty convincingly the refugees from the wars of Mycenaean Greece. They were seeking greener pastures elsewhere. Two other of the peoples I didn't mention There's one called the Shardana and another called the Shekelish, and those names are reflected in Sardinia and Sicily today. So this was a migration. They headed south, probably because Egypt was the premier power of the day. Egypt didn't want them, so then they dispersed elsewhere across the Mediterranean. Some went into Italy, as those two names indicate. The Pelazet became the Philistines. There's records of further settlement up the Levantine coast. I think the Atlanteans is a story far older than the Sea Peoples. Whether you take it literally or whether you view it as the earlier Minoan civilization or possibly somewhere in Spain, I think that's up for debate. But I don't think the Atlantean story originates with the Sea Peoples.
I'm sure that people are going to have a bunch of questions later on tonight, in the middle of the night, as you're sleeping. You're going to be like, I wish I asked that question. So there's going to be a small window here that still exists that's kind of closing. If people have a question or a thought that they want to toss out there, now is the time.
Matthew,
Oh, wait, there's
I've got
Monty.
one.
Monty and then Maureen. Okay, Monty first, then Maureen. Okay.
Okay, just a quick question. I'm considering on that. Oftentimes, there's an intent to wipe out of civilizations, like with the Library of Alexandria and so forth. And other times, there's just an intent to corrupt it. And one question I would have, I go back to Constantine, which you referred to with the Byzantine Empire in the 300, about the 300. They had the adoption of the Nicene Creed. And essentially, I look at this perhaps as an attempt to revisit the language somewhat insofar as what the actual foundation of Christianity would be. And essentially, in my interpretation of it, the fight was over whether Jesus was God or was a creation of God. And the former has tended to in mainstream Christianity. Could you comment upon that insofar as the fight at that time? Because it was also my understanding that there was a representation at the Council of Florence by the Eastern Orthodox Church, where this was also contains an issue, and Nicholas Acusa appears to represent the latter, whereas Jesus was a creation of God, and we're made in the image of God, insofar as Jesus in the Nicene Creed being God himself. Could you comment on that, please?
Well, sure. The Nicene Creed, so Constantine convened Nicaea because he himself was a new convert to Christianity. His mother was a Christian, but he himself was new to the religion. And right at the time he took over, there was this intense debate by a priest called Arius out of Alexandria, who didn't quite grasp the idea of what St. John said when he talked in his epistles about the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. He viewed, since the Son was the Son and the Father was the Father, the Son couldn't be the same as the Father, and therefore they were of similar substance rather than the same substance. And in Greek, that's homoiousion and homoousion, the difference being the letter iota. So when you hear about one iota of difference, that's where that term comes from. So there was this intense debate raging. Constantine says, I'm a Christian, but then he's like, well, what do Christians believe? I don't know it. So he convenes the first ecumenical council. Now, there had been previous regional councils centuries before at Rome, at Carthage, at Antioch. But this was the first one where all the bishops from the whole empire were ordered to gather and resolve the question. And Arius ended up being condemned as a heretic, as we know, and the Nicene Creed was adopted. However, Arianism didn't disappear right then. So, in fact, one of Constantine's sons, the one who would last the longest, Constantius, was a devout Arian. And there would be several other. It was Theodosius, whom I mentioned, who expelled the Arian bishops. But guess what? They went to the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths, who then invaded the Roman Empire from the west and reintroduced Arianism into the west. However, in the west, the Germanic-speaking Gothic elite who were Arians, coexisted peacefully with the Orthodox/Catholic Latin-speaking underclass, and eventually abandoned their Arianism and embraced Nicene Christianity with the rest of them. And you don't see Arian ideas really reappear anymore. You mentioned Nicholas of Cusa, and I would say the viewing Christ as second person of the Trinity, God, that prevails in mainstream Orthodox as well as Catholic and Western Christianity. So the Orthodox presence at Florence wouldn't have made a difference on that particular issue. There were other issues involved in that, such as the Filioque and the Nicene Creed, which is a separate issue. But as far as Nicholas of Cusa, he was a cardinal in the Catholic Church and is still, I don't believe he's a saint, but he is venerated in the church. So I don't view his statements about the image of God to be contradicting what the official Nicene view of the Trinity is in that part. Now, don't forget, too, a later controversy would arise as to the nature of Christ, whether he was solely divine or both human and divine. This is the later Council of Chalcedon in 451, and the Coptic and the Ethiopian churches, which we talked about, are what we call non-Chalcedonian, as they acknowledge the person of Christ as solely divine, or they'll say it was a new nature that's a combination of human and divine. Whereas the Orthodox, small o Orthodox view later was that Christ was both fully human and fully divine. So when Nicholas of Cusa talks about Christ being the perfect image of God, he is both divine, but also possesses a fully human nature. So I don't think anything in that statement contradicts what Nicaea said. I am not a theologian. I don't speak with any religious authority, but that's just my view of the issue.
Thank you. Maureen, are you still there?
Yeah. Hi, Matt. This is a bit off topic, but I don't know, maybe sort of.
Go for it.
Okay. It is a bit off topic. Have you done any looking into the Oralinda book?
I know about it. In fact, I've tried reading a little bit of it, but it's not the most exciting read. I know the mainstream view is that it's a forgery from the 19th century. Mm-hmm. But it is an interest. I guess I think it's an interesting concept it has is interesting. It's sort of a curiosity. Do you have anything more specific you'd like my thoughts on that?
No, not really. I mean, it is a curiosity. I mean, many people call it fake, but whenever there's whenever people does protest too much, kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. There are, if anybody wants to look into it without having to read the entire book, which is not easy to get a hold of.
It's online. It's called sacredtexts.org, I believe. It's a compilation of sacred texts from across various cultures, and they have English translations of all of them. That's where I first came across the Oralinda book. It is online.
There's also Jan OTT. He's probably a Frisian by descent. Maybe Jan van Oot. And he put out one. I don't know if that, I'm bringing that up because I don't know if what's been put out online that you can get a hold of may not be as complete as what he's putting together. I don't know. Since I have not read either one, I can't say. Asha Logos did a couple of summaries of different aspects of the book, which if you just want to know what's in the book without having to read the whole thing, which I probably would agree.
Can I just
with,
ask
would be slow
quickly,
going.
just because I've
Yeah.
never heard of this? What is it in the shortest way you could possibly say it? Why would this be important? Because I've never heard of this.
Oh, okay. Well, it's sort of looking at an aspect of European history and saying this is completely there's a inaccuracy in the chronology of the Dark Ages and what was really going on at that time, the European Dark Ages, and that there were certain influxes of movements and tribes in Europe, so that go back to Persia. So the Orlinda was written in a text that is derived in part from Persian. I mean, this could be a total hoax, right? Okay. But it also has a certain amount, deals with the flood. It has a certain amount of information on Atlantis and where Atlantis might have been. Since you're bringing up the whole Atlantis thing, I thought I'd just throw this in there. It's different than Plato's description, let's say, although Atlantis was in the Atlantic Ocean, even according to the Orlinda. So it's interesting as a sidebar. You're not going to come across it in any traditional history. Okay. There may be some reason why it was written or why it comes up episodically. Maybe some form of occultism. I don't know, but I just thought I'd bring that up because I think it deals an awful lot too, where it has some tie into the Scythians. So anyway, so that's was my reason for bringing it up.
Okay.
It has it's an ancestor. The claim is made that the Frisian civilization possessed an alphabet that was the ancestor of the Greek and Phoenician alphabets. So it's presupposing a history that goes back to about 2000 BCE up to about 900 AD.
Just if I could tack on to that, it's supposedly a chronicle of the Frisian people, and the Frisians are real people. They still exist today. In fact, Frisian language is linguistically the closest relative of English. And there were Iranic-speaking elements in the tribes that invaded Europe after them, the Alans, and there was I can't remember the other one. It spoke in Iranian language from Central Asia originally. So there's some connection there historically, for sure.
We have time for a couple more questions before we're gonna have to close it down. So let's do John, Kevin, Kelly, Jerry, and we'll have to wrap it up by around 4:30 max. So John, you have a follow-up?
I have a quick question. You've always done a huge amount of research, probably taking many years. What languages are you working with?
In this research specifically?
Yeah. Are you working just with English, or are you working with other languages?
Oh, I mean, I know several other languages. I mean, you're just talking about obtaining my sources, right?
Yes.
Oh yeah, no, I've read sources in French and German, and that's most of where I'm okay enough in ancient Greek where I can read some of the original sources in that language with some help. But yeah, those are the main languages I've worked with there.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Thank you.
Kevin. Oh, did I say Kevin? Yeah, Kevin. So Kevin, then Kelly, and Jerry, right?
All right. Hi, Adam.
Hello.
I had a question because in this presentation you talked mostly about language. Very interesting. I was wondering if you noticed maybe specifically regarding the European Dark Ages or any other civilizations, did you notice any connection between languages, like its reemergence to signal the end of a dark age, and construction of cathedrals or any like big monuments. Were there any links that you found in that regard?
I wouldn't say links, but the language comes first before the it's almost interesting. It's first comes the writing and then come the other initia of what we'll call civilization. So the monuments always become later. Like, for example, if you take the Nubian Dark Age, they repurposed the ancient Egyptian temples as churches. They just dealt with what they had, and it wasn't until later that they built their own churches after Greek models. Same thing can be said for England, Anglo-Saxon England. And in fact, a lot of the sites there, and this was true in Roman adoption of Christianity, the cathedrals were built on the sites of the old temples. That's why, the primary see the primary bishop seat in England is Canterbury. That was the capital of the Kingdom of Kent, the first place where Christianity was introduced. Same thing in Sweden, Uppsala. The Archbishop of Uppsala is the primate of the Church of Sweden, and that used to be a pagan, the main pagan temple among the Swedes. So what you see is Christianity coming in and not replacing in a sense, but more building off of the existing culture in a new way. I don't know if that addresses what your question was. Okay.
Kelly.
Yeah, the previous caller, it's kind of the same thing I was going for. Where, like, what is I always thought the Dark Age was, something where there's just a blank area where there's no history, and we don't really know what really much happened, but it's not really that, I guess. You're pretty sure it's like you were saying, the language goes first, or how did you put it? The culture.
Well,
culture went first.
When we're talking about reestablishing of after the Dark Age, it's the language, the literacy comes first, and then we have the rebuilding of the civilization. It's not so much the language goes first. I would say it's the reverse in the opposite. Right. You have the collapse of the system, we'll call it systems collapse. And then the language goes usually towards the end of that or as part of that. And then when it comes time to rebuild, we have literacy first, and then the construction of the systems that had collapsed earlier.
So if like we try to apply that today, well, here I'm in North America. I'm not like, how would I apply that? I feel like my society is breaking down.
I do too.
And I'm not like, I don't know about how literacy it is, like the literacy. I don't watch a lot of the older movies I used to watch, if that's kind of what you're getting at.
Well, yeah, what people have more immediate concerns when your society is collapsing around you. You got to figure out where your food's going to come from. And then you have other people from other areas wanting your resources and vying for them. And eventually, I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush here, but we have outside groups who are, in the cases I've studied, non-illiterate groups who, live a harsher lifestyle, never developed literacy, and want to reap the benefits of the collapsing civilization. They come in, take over, and establish themselves as the new dominant force. And then literacy doesn't come in till later.
Yeah. But all said, it's somehow it's you can almost like say a Dark Age. It's just almost like a chaos, but where people are jostling for position, trying to rebuild something new, I guess, for better or for worse.
Well, yeah, eventually they're trying to survive, and then they're trying to build something new.
Yeah, and so that would be so a dark age could be, you could look at it, the beginning of like grassroots school systems, or like the building of new institutions, things like that, like theater, but maybe at a grassroots level.
Well, yeah, that's where it has to start, because the larger systems are no longer in place.
Yeah. So if that's the case, then maybe we are going through a dark age. Perhaps it's hard to say.
I'm afraid you may be right with that. I mean, I'd like to hope we're wrong.
Yeah, I'm just trying to get like an overview and like I'd interpret all this and some of our past lectures we're doing. I'm trying to be kind of, I don't know, eclectic about the whole thing.
Well, those are good questions. I mean, because the whole point of looking at this past and this history is to get better lessons into our present and future situation, so that we don't replicate the same errors that brought about the bad, in the broadest sense of the term, throughout history. And any people who loses touch with these lessons is doomed to act in the form of universal stupidity. Like, there's universal characteristics to wisdom and discovery. There's universal characteristics to corruption and stupidity. And so that cutting off of our past from our present and future situation is one of those preconditions for that to emerge in any culture. So it's good that you're thinking in those terms, Kelly, and I hope everybody is too.
Yeah, and somehow trying to, like, avoiding any mistakes, like, yes, trying to find the mistakes that our forefathers may have made. And I think that's important, at least for me anyways.
That's why we study history.
Yes.
I'll give the last word to Jerry, and then we'll wrap her up.
Well, okay. It's not really a question. It's more like a comment. But Adam, when you were responding to Matt's question about the sea peoples, leading into the Dark Ages, both in Egypt and Greece, and you said it was the people leaving Troy after the Trojan War. It's like a light bulb went on in my head, because I remember when I read Homer's Odyssey, when Odysseus and his crew left Troy, the first thing they do is stop in this town and sack it, like as if they hadn't learned anything from 10 years of war. And Odysseus has to get them out of that mess. And then every other stop on his voyage, it's the same crew making the same stupid mistakes. And towards the end of it, there's this, some people have said to me, oh, didn't Odysseus make it to the New World, to America? And I said, well, it's possible, because other people could have done it. But I said Odysseus didn't do it because his crew was not capable of it. They weren't, disciplined or responsible enough. They didn't learn the lessons from the Trojan War. And in fact, they all died during the story, and Odysseus is the only one that survives. But when you said that, it just, a light bulb went off in my head. And I think you're right. I'm totally 100% with you on that, Adam. Anyway, thank you very much for that.
Happy I could make a light bulb go off.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you, everyone, for coming by today. This was a really, really stimulating experience. I'm really going to go back to this, and it sets the stage, I think, pretty well for what's planned next week as far as an investigation into the cathedral building revolution of that we saw in France, but spread out much more broadly around Europe during also the so-called Middle Dark Ages. And so we're going to have Pascal go through a little bit of what was behind that process for good, and maybe even some elements of bad might be weaned in there. We'll see. But that'll be next Sunday at probably 2 or 4 p.m. Not too sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the
Thanks,
great
everybody.
Thank
presentation.
you. Ciao.
Bye bye now.